were able to penetrate. Groups of soldiers wandered around lost, calling for comrades who couldn't answer because they feared revealing their positions to what they imagined to be infiltrated enemy forces. Captain Yamamoto, whose green light had initiated the entire chain of events, was perplexed when he received no coordinated response to his advance signal. Expecting the other units to move in unison for the planned attack against American positions, he encountered silence, or worse, gunfire coming from completely unexpected directions. Trying to understand what was happening, he sent a messenger to contact Tanaka's battalion. The messenger never reached his destination. In the widespread confusion, he was hit by friendly fire less than 500 meters from his starting point. The Americans, for their part, observed this chaotic situation with a peculiar mixture of profound confusion and professional caution acquired through previous experiences with unpredictable Japanese tactics. Their forward observation positions, equipped with rudimentary but still more advanced night vision binoculars than anything the Japanese possessed, clearly detected the colored flares and intense gunfire, but the completely chaotic and seemingly disorganized nature of the Japanese fire left them genuinely uncertain about exactly what was happening behind enemy lines. Colonel Robert Harrison, a 46-year veteran officer commanding a nearby American infantry regiment who had seen combat in North Africa before being transferred to the Pacific, initially assumed, based on his experience, that the Japanese were conducting some kind of nighttime fire coordination exercise or perhaps an elaborate diversionary attack designed to confuse American intelligence about their true intentions. Harrison was a methodical and cautious officer who had learned through painful experience that underestimating the Japanese enemy could be fatal. He had lost good men in carefully planned Japanese ambushes that initially appeared to be chaotic situations. Therefore, he ordered his troops to remain on high alert, but not to engage the enemy unless directly attacked or given explicit orders from headquarters. This decision, based on extremely prudent and professionally justifiable caution given the circumstances, inadvertently allowed the Japanese internal chaos to continue unchecked, exponentially amplifying its devastating effects as the night progressed and more units were engulfed by the contagious panic. As the dark hours of the tropical night slowly progressed, the situation on the Japanese lines progressively deteriorated from grave to catastrophic. Groups of soldiers, completely separated from their original units and utterly disoriented in the dense hostile jungle, wandered in the impenetrable darkness, desperately trying to find friendly positions or any recognizable landmark. Some of these groups eventually encountered other equally lost and confused Japanese soldiers, resulting in brief but extremely lethal clashes as each side automatically assumed the other was infiltrated American enemy force. Passwords and counter-passwords were shouted in the dark, but in the widespread confusion, and with men speaking different regional dialects, even correct verbal identification was not enough to prevent tragedy. The fierce military discipline, the historical cornerstone of Japanese military effectiveness that had allowed the Imperial Army to conquer vast territories in record time, had completely collapsed in significant sectors of the defensive line. Officers attempting to restore some order discovered to their horror that their men were so deeply terrified and utterly confused that verbal orders were systematically ignored or grotesquely misinterpreted. One captain later reported that when he ordered high fire, several of his men interpreted it as high enemy fire detected and opened fire again. Language, a fundamental tool of military command, had become useless in that maelstrom of fear and confusion. Major Sato, realizing something was terribly wrong when his shots were not met with consistent enemy fire, finally ordered a ceasefire and sent out reconnaissance patrols. One of these patrols returned with alarming information. They had found several bodies of Japanese soldiers, clearly killed by Japanese weapons. The realization that they were shooting their own comrades caused a profound shock to Sato's troops. Morale, already weakened by the adverse strategic situation, suffered another devastating blow. Some veteran soldiers who had survived brutal campaigns in China and the Philippines simply sat in silence, unable to process the horror of what had happened. When dawn finally arrived, revealing the full extent of the disaster, the picture was even worse than any Japanese officer could have imagined. Approximately 140 Japanese soldiers lay dead or wounded, victims solely of friendly fire. More than 300 had abandoned their positions and were scattered throughout the jungle, many without weapons or equipment. The defenses carefully prepared over weeks of hard work were in ruins, not due to American bombing, but to hasty evacuation and abandonment of posts. Precious ammunition, in an already critical supply, had been wasted firing on imaginary targets. And perhaps most importantly, the trust between units, essential for coordinated operations, had been severely damaged. Lieutenant Tanaka, emerging from his retreating position in the higher mountains, gradually realized the magnitude of his mistake. When he finally made contact with Captain Yamamoto and they compared their respective versions of the night's events, the terrible truth became clear. The green signal that Tanaka had interpreted as a chemical attack alert was simply Yamamoto's coordination signal for the planned advance. There was no chemical attack. There was no American night assault. There was only an incomplete memo, an altered code, and the catastrophic consequences of failed communication in a high-stress environment. The effects of this incident extended far beyond the immediate casualties. When the Japanese command on Leyte conducted a full assessment of the situation, they discovered that the night panic had critically compromised their defensive capabilities in an entire sector of the island. Abandoned positions were quickly occupied by American patrols who, without firing a single shot, gained vital ground that would have cost hundreds of lives in a direct assault. Colonel Harrison, still confused about the events of the previous night, but pragmatic enough to exploit opportunities, ordered an immediate advance through the weakened Japanese lines. His troops found empty trenches, abandoned bunkers, and discarded equipment in quantities that suggested a hasty retreat. For the Japanese High Command, the incident represented an internal public relations nightmare. How could they explain to already demoralized soldiers that their own forces had destroyed themselves through unfounded panic? The decision was to cover up the incident, attributing the casualties to special enemy night action. Official reports mentioned American unconventional warfare tactics without specifying details. This institutional lie, while understandable from a morale maintenance standpoint, prevented crucial lessons from being learned and disseminated to other units facing similar situations. Lieutenant Tanaka survived the Leyte campaign, one of the few hundred Japanese who managed to evacuate the island before the complete American consolidation. For the remaining months of the war, he carried the weight of that terrible night. In his memoirs written decades later, he reflected on how a single misinterpreted signal had triggered a cascade of events that resulted in more deaths than many actual battles he had fought. "I discovered that night," he wrote, "that fear doesn't need real foundation to be lethal. It was enough that we believed in the danger for us to become our own enemies." Post-war analysis of this incident, conducted by American and Japanese military historians, revealed several fundamental lessons about communication in combat and the dangers of psychological warfare. First, it demonstrated how signaling systems, no matter how well designed, are vulnerable to errors when changes are not adequately communicated to all units involved. Second, it illustrated how combat stress can dramatically amplify reactions to ambiguous stimuli, transforming neutral signals into catalysts for panic. Third, it showed the dangers of rigid military doctrines that do not allow for flexibility of interpretation in confusing situations. The Japanese had been trained to follow signal codes literally, without question. When the code was corrupted, this rigidity became fatal. For the Americans, the incident offered valuable insights into the psychological vulnerabilities of their enemy forces. American Army psychological warfare specialists carefully studied, captured intelligence reports describing the incident, using this information to develop future tactics. They realized that Japanese forces, despite their reputation for ironclad discipline, were in fact highly susceptible to misinformation and confusion when their command and control systems were compromised. This realization would influence subsequent psychological operations in the Philippines and eventually the preparation for the invasion of Japan itself. The most ironic aspect of the incident was that it perfectly demonstrated the concept of induced fear signaling that the Japanese had theorized, except that it worked in the completely opposite direction to what was intended. Japanese strategists had envisioned using specific visual stimuli to create panic among American troops. Instead, it was their own signaling systems, corrupted by communication failure, that induced exactly the kind of mass panic they hoped to inflict on the enemy. The psychological weapon, so to speak, had detonated prematurely and harmed its creators. This pattern of psychological warfare, having unintended effects, was more common than generally recognized during World War II. Both sides developed elaborate tactics to demoralize and confuse the enemy, but frequently underestimated how these tactics could backfire. Japanese, in particular, had invested significant resources in propaganda and psychological warfare, but their approach often failed to consider how their own troops might be equally vulnerable to the same psychological effects they sought to exploit in the enemy. The Leyte fear signal incident was simply the most dramatic example of this conceptual flaw. In the years following the end of the war, Japanese survivors of the incident rarely discussed what had happened. The shame associated with the event, combined with Japanese military culture that emphasized honor above all else, made it impossible to publicly acknowledge that they had been defeated not by the enemy, but by their own panic. Lieutenant Tanaka was a rare exception when he finally published his account in the 1970s. Even then, he faced criticism from veterans who preferred to remain silent about episodes they considered dishonorable. From the perspective of modern military science, the incident offers lessons that remain relevant. The fog of war, a concept articulated by the Prussian military theorist Karl von Clausewitz, has never been demonstrated as dramatically as on that night in Leyte. Clausewitz argued that war is characterized by uncertainty, chance, and attrition that prevent even the best-laid plans from being executed perfectly. The fear signal incident exemplifies this perfectly. A coordinated, carefully crafted, and theoretically sound attack plan collapsed completely due to a single undelivered memorandum and the subsequent cascade of misunderstandings. Modern military communication technology was developed largely to prevent precisely this type of catastrophe. Redundant communication systems, multi-check protocols, and extensive training in stressful situations are all designed to minimize the possibility of signals being misinterpreted. But the story of the fear signal at Leyte serves as a grim reminder that no system is completely foolproof against human error, especially when combined with extreme stress, fatigue, and fear. The human factor remains the most unpredictable and potentially destructive element in any military operation. For historians of the Pacific War, the incident also illuminates often neglected aspects of the Japanese experience during the final stages of the conflict. The dominant narrative tends to focus on Japanese fanatical resistance and their willingness to fight to the death. But the Leyte incident reveals a more complex reality. Japanese soldiers were human beings, subject to the same fears and psychological vulnerabilities that affect all combatants. Their discipline, while impressive, was not invulnerable. Under sufficient pressure and in sufficiently confusing circumstances, even the best-trained troops could succumb to panic. The enduring legacy of the incident extends far beyond its immediate historical significance in the Leyte campaign. It represents a fundamental and extremely valuable case study of how seemingly robust communication systems can fail catastrophically, how irrational fear spreads exponentially in hierarchical organizations under stress, and how psychological warfare can have utterly devastating unintended consequences that surpass anything its original proponents imagined. For modern militaries worldwide studying this incident in war academies and command schools, the case offers a solemn warning about the dangers of relying excessively on coded communication systems without implementing adequate redundancies and multi-checking protocols. For military psychologists and researchers of human behavior in combat, it unequivocally demonstrates the critical importance of considering how extreme and prolonged stress fundamentally affects the human capacity to interpret information correctly, even seemingly simple and straightforward information. And for military historians seeking to understand not only the great battles but also the human details of the conflict, the incident provides a fascinating and unique window into the profoundly human aspects of warfare that are often obscured by grander narratives of brilliant strategies and epic battles. When we consider the full and comprehensive impact of that fateful night in the Leyte Mountains, we must recognize that its consequences extended far beyond the immediate casualty figures, however tragic they were. The critical and irreversible weakening of Japanese defenses in vital sectors of the island contributed directly to the rapid American consolidation of strategic positions, which in turn dramatically accelerated the complete liberation of the Philippines and significantly brought closer the inevitable end of the war in the Pacific. In a certain profound and ironic historical sense, the simple green light that Captain Yamamoto fired, with completely benign and professionally correct intentions, inadvertently became one of the truly decisive moments of the entire Philippine campaign, not for its intended function of coordinating the attack, but for its completely unintended catastrophic effect of destroying Japanese defensive cohesion. Military history is absolutely replete with such bitter ironies, critical moments where blind chance and understandable human error irreversibly alter the course of events in ways that no strategist, however brilliant, could ever foresee or plan for. For Lieutenant Tanaka, who miraculously survived not only the Leyte campaign but also the remainder of the war and lived to a very advanced age, eventually seeing his defeated country transform from a bitter enemy into a close ally of the United States during the Cold War, the vivid and agonizing memory of that terrible night in the mountains never completely left him despite the passing decades. In his last recorded interview, given to a Japanese historian a few months before his peaceful death in 1992, at the age of 83, he was asked about the most important lesson he had learned from his long and traumatic wartime experience. His response was characteristically reflective and profoundly philosophical, marked by a hard-won wisdom gained through indescribable suffering. "I learned through pain that the true enemy is not always on the other side of the battlefield waiting to destroy us. Sometimes, and perhaps more often than we would like to admit, it resides deep within our own irrational fears, in our stubborn inability to critically question what our eyes see and our ears hear, in our reckless haste to react violently without fully understanding the true situation. On that terrible night in Leyte that still haunts my dreams, we were not defeated by the Americans with their superior weapons and unlimited resources. We were utterly defeated by a simple colored signal that we failed to understand correctly, and by the utterly paralyzing fear that this basic misunderstanding unleashed like a demon from its box. It is a bitter lesson that I sincerely hope will never be forgotten by future generations, because to forget it would be to condemn other young people to repeat our tragic mistakes." And so, the incident of the fear signal remains a powerful and poignant testament to the inherent fragility of human communication in moments of extreme crisis, to the surprising ease with which carefully constructed order can dissolve into utter chaos when certain conditions are met, and to the utterly critical importance of understanding not only our sophisticated weapons and elaborate tactics, but also our own deep psychological vulnerabilities that we often prefer to ignore. In an age of increasingly sophisticated and seemingly infallible military technology, where wars can theoretically be fought through instantaneous digital signals and satellite communications spanning the globe in milliseconds, the seemingly simple story of a misinterpreted green light in the remote Leyte Mountains serves as a timeless and soberly relevant reminder that ultimately, and despite all our advanced technology, it is fallible human beings who interpret these digital or analog signals, and human beings are always and inevitably susceptible to primal fear, cognitive confusion, and error in judgment, especially when exhausted, hungry, ill, and terrified of impending death. Perhaps the most humble lesson of the incident is the ultimate one, that war, despite all its modern technology and meticulous strategic planning, remains fundamentally a human activity conducted by imperfect human beings, operating under conditions that test the absolute limits of physical and psychological endurance. And when we ignore this basic truth, when we assume our systems are perfect and communications infallible, we risk repeating the tragic mistakes of that night in Leyte, where a simple, misinterpreted colored signal turned allies into enemies and fear into destruction. It is a lesson that transcends borders and historical eras, as relevant today as it was on that tropical October night in 1944, remaining relevant as long as humans wage war.